Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, August 31st. Our topic today centers around how we're going to reach the state's climate and energy goals and the pathway forward around renewable energy sources. So here to discuss that with us today, we're really pleased to welcome Jared Duval, who's the executive director of the Energy Action Network, which is a diverse network of over 200 nonprofits, businesses, and public agencies here in Vermont. Jared, welcome to the News Project.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you, and thank you very much for making the time for this conversation, a very important one for sure. But first, I just thought to get us started, tell us a little bit about the Energy Action Network. I wondered if you could maybe unpack your organization's mission and how you work towards that.
Absolutely. So Energy Action Network really is two things. First and foremost, it's, as you said, a network of over 200 member organizations in Vermont. Basically any organization in the state that is committed to meeting the state's climate commitments and renewable energy goals, and doing so in a way that achieves a more just, thriving and sustainable future for Vermonters. And so that network comes together at an annual summit. We have different teams that collaborate on different projects. But in support of that network, we also have a small nonprofit organization called Energy EAN, that we have a staff of 3. We're based in Montpelier, and we play 2 key roles for the network and for the state of Vermont. One is that we convene the network at different events like our annual summit. We have one coming up September 28th and 29th in Warren at Sugarbush. But then we also do a lot of research, analysis, tracking in terms of where we stand, what it will take to meet the state's climate commitments and renewable energy goals. And in the kind of thing that we're best known for in that realm, in terms of the research and analysis, is the annual progress report for Vermont that we produce on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. And our 2023 annual progress report is coming out next month in September and will be available at eanvt.org on our website.
So, in general, do you see that we're on track to meet the state's climate and energy goals? I mean, those sound fairly ambitious. Reducing Vermont's greenhouse gas pollution to 26% below 2005 levels by 2025 and 40% below the 1990 levels by 2030. And we also want to meet our total energy needs from renewable, or 25% of our total energy needs from renewable sources by 2025. On the face of it, like I said, they sound ambitious, but are they achievable, and are we getting there on time?
Yeah, I think that whether they are ambitious or not ambitious may depend on a frame of reference. So I want to back up and talk about kind of where they come from. And the United States participates in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and as part of that process, worked on the Paris Agreement or the Paris Accords, which had multiple countries setting what they call nationally defined contributions in terms of climate pollution reduction. And the commitment that our national government made, the United States government made, was exactly that target that you just mentioned, Andrew, a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2025. And so Vermont has long had kind of goals on the books for climate pollution reduction. But as of 2020, passed a law called the Global Warming Solutions Act that turned those into requirements, into legal obligations. And they're nothing different than what our national government committed to. So it is reflective of Vermont doing our part towards that national commitment. But where did that commitment come from? I mean, it was really, that was the target for the amount of emissions that would need to be reduced to avoid the most dangerous kind of climate disruption, things that would occur after 2 degrees Celsius, or what is that, 3.6 degrees, something like that, Fahrenheit of warming. And so a lot of folks would say that we should be reducing emissions more deeply and more quickly than that if we want to be doing our part to avoid, impacts that may not be the worst possible, but they're still going to be pretty bad, which we know are already happening and are baked in, unfortunately, to kind of the emissions that have already been put into the atmosphere.
What do you see then as the biggest roadblocks that we face to reaching them? I know this is a politically very charged conversation where there's a lot of pushback one reads about that says, hey, climate change may be real and it may be happening, but we do this and we're going to kind of create some economic problems and it's going to be unfairly distributed across the economy. Some people are going to be hurt more than others. There'll be winners and losers, and that's not right. But maybe you've thought about this deeply. I guess I was wondering, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we're facing to kind of get to where we need to be, to reduce the level of climate change impact as much as possible?
I think that there's really two types of challenges that come to the front of my mind. One is agreeing that we should act and that we have a role to play. I mean, that is still contested, unfortunately. And then the second is when we decide to act, how to do it. So let me just take those in turn. I think that there are a number of voices in Vermont that, unfortunately, from my perspective, will say Vermont is too small to make a difference. We shouldn't act on climate. Let other bigger countries deal with this. And of course, if every single state, every single country in the world could say that they alone are not going to be able to solve the climate crisis. And if and when everybody says that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the way that I think about it is Vermont has committed in law to doing our part. No more, no less. We are not talking about taking responsibility for reducing emissions for other states. We're talking about doing our part towards our national commitment. And I think the first thing we need to do is recognize that that is a legal obligation that was established through the democratic process, through hundreds of thousands of Vermonters working with their state representatives and senators saying, we feel like we need to meet this scientific imperative, do our part towards this moral responsibility, and that is now the law of the land in Vermont, as much as some folks wish that it wasn't and will still kind of say that we should not act. But then the second piece is, once we agree to act, how do we meet those emissions reduction commitments? And some context here is important. Vermont has, Energy Action Network has recently, in our latest annual progress report and in a forthcoming research paper, compared the climate pollution from every state across New England and the Northeast, and how much progress has been made since 2005. And what we found, unfortunately, is that Vermont has made the least progress towards that Paris commitment, or the Global Warming Solutions Act commitment, of any state in the Northeast, and that we have the second highest per capita emissions in New England, behind only New Hampshire, and we have the third highest per capita emissions in the entire Northeast, with only New Hampshire and Pennsylvania producing more climate pollution per person than Vermont. And the reason for that is that the vast amount of our climate pollution comes from the fossil fuels that we use for how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. Transportation and thermal are the biggest polluting sectors that are responsible together for about 3/4 of Vermont's climate pollution. Now, historically, Vermont has made incredible progress in terms of electric efficiency. We were the first state in the country to establish an efficiency utility, a statewide efficiency utility, that model with Efficiency Vermont and others, and that has spread to other states and other countries, thankfully. And we've also done some really important work in cleaning up our electricity sector. We have more to do, but Vermont is already the least carbon intensive, or has the lowest emitting electricity portfolio of any state in the country. Now, that's important, and that actually gives us a great foundation for progress, because when we do things in Vermont, like switch from fossil vehicles to electric vehicles, or we switch or reduce dependence on fossil fuel heating with things like cold climate heat pumps or heat pump water heaters, we get a bigger pollution reduction benefit from that switch than anywhere else, because we're using even cleaner electricity than any other state in the country. The other thing that is often not well known about electric vehicles and about heat pumps is that they are just so much more efficient at using energy. You know, an internal combustion vehicle, a gas car, about 16 to 25% of the fossil fuel that's used in that car, only that fraction of it goes to actually propelling the car. Most of it's lost through heat and other engine losses, whereas electric motors are just far more efficient. And because of things like regenerative braking, about 85% of the energy that goes into an electric vehicle actually ends up propelling it. So you're getting 4 times more of what you want out of it for the energy input, 4 times more efficient to use technologies like electric vehicles than gas vehicles. And the same thing is true on the heat pump side, because you're not generating heat the way that a furnace or a boiler or even old electric resistance baseboard heating systems are. You're transferring heat, almost like a refrigerator or an air conditioner does. And therefore you can get these efficiencies that are, on average 4 times greater than our existing heating systems. So we have this potential for a massive win-win opportunity. On the one hand, to utilize that clean electricity as we get off of fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel in the transportation sector, and like fuel oil, propane, kerosene, fossil gas in the heating sector. But we can also use far less energy overall because of the greater efficiency of modern electric technology.
I think your point about the per capita consumption of the average Vermonter is an important one, and I think it's one that's overlooked a lot, because I too have heard that argument made that, hey, we're a small state, we're not going to account for very much. What people do in Shanghai in one day is going to offset everything we're going to do here. But the fact that because we're a rural state and we need cars to get around because our public transportation system isn't going to help us very much get to work for many folks, that means we will drive more perhaps than folks in other places. And also we have, I guess, a lot of old housing stock as well that has older heating systems and that drives up that per capita consumption too on the thermal heating side.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it comes down to, this may be overly simplified, but I think the choice is really, do we want to choose to step up and meet our responsibility to do our part, or are we going to shirk our responsibility? And, I grew up in Vermont. My family has been in Vermont a long time, and I grew up steeped in Vermont history. And every example that I can think of, I can't think of any time in Vermont history where we've pointed to our heroes and said, when they've said, "Oh, we're too small to make a difference," or we should not take responsibility. Whether it was the passage of marriage equality, we didn't say, "Well, we're not going to do this because most gay and lesbian folks live outside of Vermont. It's not going to make a difference for them." No, we made a difference for the folks who lived in Vermont, and then that example spread beyond our borders. We've seen this in kind of national conflicts in the past, whether it was during the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. After the shot heard around the world was fired, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys didn't say, "Well, we're not going to try to do anything. This is a bigger fight than us." So no, they went and took Fort Ticonderoga and captured cannon and mortar that helped the United States win the Revolution. Vermont punched way above its weight in terms of its per capita contribution in the Civil War. You can go on and on. But this argument that you shouldn't act because one person can't make a difference, I think, is antithetical to the example in Vermont in U.S. history. And I would say, as part of this recent analysis that we've done at EAN, even if you don't look at per capita emissions, you just look at total emissions, I think it's also important to remember that as a state, we have been heavily burning fossil fuels for almost 2 centuries now. And there's now a global database that looks at total cumulative historical emissions over time. And we plugged in what those would be for Vermont. And what we found is, again, not on even on a per capita basis, just on a total emissions basis since 1850, we estimate that Vermont has produced more total climate pollution than about 70 countries around the world. So no matter how you look at it, current responsibility, historical responsibility, I think that we need to do our part to reduce that pollution. And what I hope we can get to next is that this is not just a moral responsibility and a legal obligation. There is also massive economic opportunity in this, both for Vermont individuals and households, and in terms of strengthening our Vermont economy.
Well, let's talk about that part then. What is the economic advantage or the case for that, for shifting to renewable sources of energy and moving forward on those technologies? In the long run, I take it that will save us money, but it seems like the short-term impact is a higher upfront cost, and that seems to be a problem, like with heat pumps, for instance, or electric vehicles. It involves a higher upfront cost, which is amortized over time, and over time that saves money. But you're the person who knows way more about this than I do. So what is that case then for the economic benefit that the state would get by moving in that direction?
Yeah, so I think about it in 2 ways. One is kind of at the household level, and then one is the big picture of the kind of statewide economy. So to start at the individual level, I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind. We have graphs in Energy Action Network's annual progress report for Vermont that compare the relative costs of transportation and heating fuels over time. And what we see, and I think most Vermonters know this, anybody who fills up at a gas pump or is paying their fuel dealer a bill for fuel oil or propane, that over time, fossil fuels are generally higher cost and much more price volatile than the alternatives. So let me be more specific about that. Gasoline and diesel are much higher cost and much more price volatile than the equivalent cost of charging and maintaining an electric vehicle. And so you can achieve significant savings over the lifetime of the vehicle by driving electric versus driving gas. So what does that look like? If you plug in an electric vehicle just based on the statewide average electric rate, it's the equivalent of paying only $1.50 a gallon. And many utility territories have EV rates where you pay even less. Like Green Mountain Power, it's the equivalent of about $1 a gallon. EVs have also been shown to have lower maintenance costs. But you bring up a very good point that many people focus, rightly so, understandably so, on the upfront cost of that equipment. And this is where incentives really matter, because a lot of folks will say, okay, I can save money over time, but how do I make this upfront investment? And the great news is that thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, there are significant rebates, incentives available at the federal level for everything that we're talking about: electric vehicles, heat pump water heaters, weatherization, and there's many state programs that can incentives can be added onto that to further lower the cost, both from the state of Vermont and from utilities and Efficiency Vermont. So we're at a point now where you compare the upfront cost of an electric vehicle to a gas vehicle, whether new or used, and often it costs less upfront to go with the electric vehicle now because of those incentives. And then, oh, by the way, you're still getting the lower cost, the cost-saving benefits of lower cost electricity versus paying, $3-4 a gallon for gas, and getting off of those high cost and price volatile dependence on things like fuel oil and propane. So on an individual level, there are significant economic cost savings to be had from this shift.
I wondered if we could pivot a little bit and talk about the Affordable Heat Act that the legislature passed this past spring. which is certainly an important component of how all of this is going to unfold. I guess, first of all, I wondered if you could maybe just remind us of what's in the Act and how it's supposed to work. And do you feel like this is a good enough step in the right direction? I know it built on a previous piece of legislation that was passed in 2022, vetoed by Governor Scott, and that veto was upheld by, I think, one vote. And then the legislature came back with the Affordable Heating Act. So is that going to get us to where we need to be quickly enough?
Well, if it's okay, I want to answer that question. I just want to go back 1 second to finish the kind of economic picture.
Sure.
And go to the kind of statewide level. And just briefly want to note that any time that we spend money on fossil fuels in Vermont, those fossil fuels are 100% imported. And so on average, about 75 cents of every dollar that we spend on them drains out of the state economy. It's the cost of the commodity from the importing countries and states that those dollars are going to. In contrast, when we spend our energy dollars on electricity, that ratio gets flipped. And about 3/4 of the money we spend on electricity, whether it's to charge an EV or to heat with heat pump, water or space with heat pumps, about 75 cents of every dollar stays and recirculates in Vermont. And so this is a massive opportunity. In 2020, is it 2020 or 2021? Anyway, in one of those years, we spent about $2.5 billion as a state on fossil fuels. That's a significant chunk. Our gross state product is somewhere around $35 billion. And so, when 3/4 of that is draining out of state, it's a significant drain on our state economy. Whereas when we're spending our energy dollars in a way that stays more local, it helps support our neighbors, contribute to local, the retention and creation of more local jobs, and keeping more money recirculating in state. So this is also a massive, it's not just a consumer savings opportunity, it's an economic development, economic resilience strategy for Vermont, keeping more dollars local. When you invest in something like weatherization, it's local labor doing it. When you're paying the electric utility, most of those costs go to line workers and tree trimmers and, clean power producers, things like that. So that's another really important part of the conversation. But to answer your question about the Affordable Heat Act, and here I want to say there's an important distinction between two different roles that I have. So Energy Action Network does not take positions on policies or bills before the legislature or any administrative body. We don't do any lobbying. However, I was appointed in 2020 to the Vermont Climate Council, to the seat for somebody with expertise in energy and data analysis. And what the Vermont Climate Council was charged with the responsibility of doing is writing Vermont's first climate action plan. And in that plan has to be recommendations, including policy recommendations. And so I want to be really clear that when a clean heat standard, which is what the Affordable Heat Act would establish, that's not a position that EAN, we don't have a position on that. But as a member of the Vermont Climate Council who co-authored the Climate Action Plan, that was one of the 3 highest impact recommendations that were in the Climate Action Plan for how Vermont can meet our emissions reduction obligation. And so your question, I think, was, will that alone get us there? It won't, but it would be the single largest step that has yet been identified and that is included in Vermont's Climate Action Plan to achieving that pollution reduction obligation. And on net is expected to save Vermonters a significant amount of money because of that switch away from high cost and price volatile fossil fuel dependence towards more efficient options, helping more Vermonters weatherize and get more of their heating from heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, among other options. There's also possibility for advanced wood heating systems, for wood heating, for certain types of biofuels, provided that they meet the life cycle emissions reduction requirements that are laid out in the law.
We only have a few minutes left to discuss some of this, and there's so many questions. I'd love to throw your way, but one of them I think pertains a little bit to one of the points you were making earlier about the economic benefits of this, and that I guess pertains to workforce. It clearly will need a lot of folks to install solar panels, install heat pumps, put electrical upgrades in place. Do we have the workforce for that, or can you basically tell us roughly how many jobs do you think this might create? Are we talking hundreds, thousands, or what's the possible outlook for that? Because that would seem to be a very strong economic argument for moving towards the renewable energy sources.
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of a good news portion to this and more work to be done. I mean, the good news is that Vermont has about 18,000 workers who are in the clean energy sector and estimated to have more than 19,000 kind of in the climate workforce, defined even more broadly than that. And that is the highest share of workers in the clean energy workforce of any state in the country. So it's really strong. But exactly as you say, we need a lot more folks coming into those fields to do the weatherization projects, to do the installations of heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, advanced wood heating installations, EV chargers, electric panel upgrades, and on and on. That's a major focus. We actually have a network action team on climate workforce. It's been a big focus of the legislature and a number of our partners. For folks who want to learn more about that, I'd encourage you to check out the Energy Action Network website, check out the Climate Workforce Network Action Team. But it is a major challenge and opportunity going forward that it's going to need a lot of folks working together with multiple solutions.
And just finally, before we have to run, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the summit meeting that your organization is going to be hosting on September 28th and 29th up at Sugarbush. This is a day-long conference, I guess, or day-and-a-half long conference, where folks can really take a deep dive into all of these issues.
We will unveil our 2023 annual progress report for Vermont there. We'll have a panel of statewide leaders responding to the question of what does climate leadership look like now and how are they prioritizing it in their work. We'll have a number of people to announce, but I can share we just got confirmation that Attorney General Charity Clark will be speaking at the event, among others. It will have time for our network members to collaborate on, including on that climate workforce team. Yeah, I mean, really what EAN is all about is there is so much complexity and nuance to energy and climate conversations. And I think there's a lot of times that they're presented in an overly simplistic kind of black or white way. And what we believe, our commitment is that those conversations, our energy and climate conversations that happen statewide, should be grounded in the latest available and the highest quality data, and we need to have an evidence and a facts-based conversation. You know, unfortunately, there is a lot of myth and misinformation out there in the energy and climate space. And so, you know, our basic commitment is let's do the research, let's do the analysis in an objective, careful way so that we can have a serious and civil conversation about the state's future. We're looking forward to sharing the latest research and analysis in that annual progress report for Vermont and at this upcoming summit on September 28th.
Fortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Boy, there's a whole host of other aspects that we could talk about in questions, but well, maybe we'll have another opportunity sometime. But Jared Duval, thank you again for making the time for this conversation. Really appreciate that. And thanks to all of you for sharing part of your day with us. Appreciate your time. We'll see you again the next time.